now I'm going to invite Kevin, who's going to do the second part of this training session. And he's going to talk about human rights, the rights that the homeless people in Australia have, the rights that those people sleeping on the streets in Dum Dum have, the rights that those people in the charity response to the need that you were responding to, the rights that they have. Okay, Kevin is now going to throw a little more light on that. So over to you now, Kevin.
Thank you, Tino. So Tino has given us an introduction to the charity approach and then the justice or the advocacy approach to human rights. I'm going to cover three things in my part of this presentation. First of all, I'm going to say a brief word about the United Nations organization, and then I'm going to focus on human rights. And I'm also going to share a little bit about the Human Rights Council. So three things: a quick look at the United Nations system, human rights, and then the Human Rights Council. So bear with me while I share my screen. So the UNO, what are the what are the objectives of the UNO? Excuse me. So these are the objectives. This is why the UNO was established, to achieve cooperation in international law. So the UNO is working at the international level, trying to bring about cooperation in international law. It's also very interested in international security. It's dealing with economic development and with social progress. Human rights are also a big concern of the United Nations organization, and I highlight it in red because that's where the work of Edmund Rice International is focused on human rights. And finally, it's concerned about world peace. So these are the 6 objectives of the UNO on the international scale. And there are 6 principal organs of the UNO. You've all heard of the General Assembly, which meets in New York. You've heard of the Security Council, which also meets in New York. And the Economic and Social Council, which meets in New York. Then there's the International Court of Justice, which deals with legal matters at the international level. And there's a vast secretariat which supports the work of the UNO across the world. The UNO has got offices here in Geneva, New York, Vienna, Nairobi, and so on. And there's a secretariat there that does the backup work for all these meetings and various organizations within the UNO. And finally, there's a group called the Trusteeship Council, which I put in brackets because it's not functioning at the moment. But after the UNO was set up in 1948, the Trusteeship Council was dealing with countries and states that were seeking independence. Now that has kind of passed over now, and the Trusteeship Council is in abeyance. So these are the 6 principal organs of the UNO. These oversee a range of other subsidiary bodies. There are many committees, boards, working parties, groups like UNESCO, groups like the International Labour Organization, the World Health Organization. These are all part of the UNO. But one particular group that I want to pay attention to later on in this presentation is the Human Rights Council. And the Human Rights Council is one of the most important of these subsidiary bodies. So in our work here in Geneva, we have frequent interactions with the work of the Human Rights Council. And actually, the Human Rights Council is meeting at the moment. As we speak here today, the council is in session. And it's been in session for the month of March. And it will be concluding now on the 1st of April. So the March meeting of the Human Rights Council is taking place as we speak today. So that's just a brief overview of the United Nations organization. So moving on now, I'm moving to the second part of my presentation, which is human rights. So like Tino, I'm asking you the question, when you hear the word human rights, what comes to mind? Just take a moment to think about that. What comes into your mind when you hear the word human rights? Could you define human rights? Could you say what human rights are? And there's the question, what are human rights? So let's take a look at the words, just take the word human. A member of Homo sapiens species, a man, woman, or child, a person. So we're talking about people. Rights, things to which you are entitled or allowed, freedoms that are guaranteed. So there are two sides to rights, things to which you're entitled, and then freedoms that are protected or guaranteed. And then human rights are the rights you have simply because you are human. There's a simple definition of human rights. The rights that you have, that I have, that every person has, simply because they're a human person. And as I mentioned, if you were to ask people in the street, what are human rights? You'd get many different answers. So as these definitions above show, a right is a freedom of some kind. It's something to which you are entitled by virtue of being human. So I'm now going to show a video. I'm now going to share my screen and show a video explaining human rights in some greater detail.
Take your cursor to the start. It's at the end. Yeah. Sorry. Why would I enlarge it? Right.
The idea of human rights is that each one of us, no matter who we are or where we are born, is entitled to the same basic rights and freedoms. Human rights are not privileges, and they cannot be granted or revoked. They are inalienable and universal. That may sound straightforward enough, but it gets incredibly complicated as soon as anyone tries to put the idea into practice. What exactly are the basic human rights? Who gets to pick them? Who enforces them, and how? The history behind the concept of human rights is a long one. Throughout the centuries and across societies, religions, and cultures, we have struggled with defining notions of rightfulness, justice, and rights. But one of the most modern affirmations of universal human rights emerged from the ruins of World War II with the creation of the United Nations. The treaty that established the UN gives as one of its purposes to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. And with the same spirit, in 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This document, written by an international committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, lays the basis for modern international human rights law. The Declaration is based on the principle that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. It lists 30 articles recognizing, among other things, the principle of non-discrimination and the right to life and liberty. It refers to negative freedoms, like the freedom from torture or slavery, as well as positive freedoms, such as the freedom of movement and residence. It encompasses basic civil and political rights, such as freedom of expression, religion, or peaceful assembly, as well as social, economic, and cultural rights, such as the right to education and the right to freely choose one's occupation.
You have to share again, Kevin.
Has grown, deepening and expanding our understanding of what human rights are and how to better protect them. So if these principles are so well developed, then why are human rights abused and ignored time and time again all over the world? The problem, in general, is that it is not at all easy to universally enforce these rights or to punish transgressors. The UDHR itself, despite being highly authoritative and respected, is a declaration, not a hard law. So when individual countries violate it, the mechanisms to address those violations are weak. For example, the main bodies within the UN in charge of protecting human rights mostly monitor and investigate violations, but they cannot force states to, say, change a policy or compensate a victim. That's why some critics say it's naive to consider human rights a given in a world where state interests wield so much power. Critics also question the universality of human rights and emphasize that their development has been heavily guided by a small number of mostly Western nations, to the detriment of inclusiveness. The result? A general bias in favor of civil political liberties over socio-political rights, and of individual over collective or groups' rights. Others defend universal human rights laws and point at the positive role they have on setting international standards and helping activists in their campaigns. They also point out that not all international human rights instruments are powerless. For example, the European Convention on Human Rights establishes a court where the 47 member countries and their citizens can bring cases. The court issues binding decisions that each member state must comply with. Human rights law is constantly evolving, as are our views and definitions of what the basic human rights should be. For example, how basic or important is the right to democracy or to development? And as our lives are increasingly digital, should there be a right to access the internet? A right to digital privacy? What do you think?
So you've seen that presentation on human rights. And of course, over the centuries, there's been a struggle to actually state what human rights are. But after 1948, we had the Declaration of Human Rights established by the UN. It's also important to remember there that it talked about the fact that people are sometimes disappointed in how human rights are actually implemented. And we see at the moment in the world, there's a lot of backsliding. That's a word that's been used quite a lot. There's backsliding on human rights. And of course, what's happening in Ukraine is a very, very kind of powerful example of that. So I want to go back then again to my PowerPoint presentation. So again, just bear with me a moment while I go back. So as we heard in the video, human rights, words that are used to describe human rights are universal and inalienable. They apply to all people everywhere, at all times. They can be denied or violated, but they still exist. You can't take them away. They belong to each one of us, universal, inalienable. They're indivisible. There are 30 articles in the Declaration of Human Rights. They're all equally important. They all must be respected. And they're interdependent and interrelated. Often the fulfillment of one right depends wholly or in part on the fulfillment of others. You could take the right to education as a right, and yet if children are coming to school hungry, they mightn't benefit from education. So the right to food could be connected to the fulfillment of the right to education. There can also be there can be sometimes a balance needed between different rights. As we saw in the video, freedom of speech and the right to privacy. There could be a conflict there sometimes. We also might mention abortion, where there's the rights to the health of the woman and there's the rights of the unborn child. And we know that there can be a tension there as well. Another thing is that no country has a perfect record of human rights. And we see that when we attend the Human Rights Council here in Geneva. Countries come up for review. They're praised maybe for certain steps they have taken, but there are also recommendations are made about how they can improve their human rights performance. So these are words that are frequently associated with human rights: universal, inalienable, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. The need for a balance between certain rights, and then that no country has a perfect record of human rights. Another question we might ask is, who is responsible for ensuring human rights? So just take a moment to reflect on that question. Who is responsible for ensuring human rights? And then two other groups of people that are important. Two titles are rights holders and duty bearers. So rights holders are the people who hold the human rights. Each one of us is a rights holder. And the duty bearers then are groups or people who are expected to respond to our human rights. They're the people with responsibility, people in leadership, governments, in schools, teachers, parents, they're duty bearers. So there's rights holders and duty bearers. And sometimes rights holders need to become aware of their rights. Very often people don't know what their human rights are. So part of the work of ERI would be raising awareness about human rights, making people aware you have these rights. And then hopefully when people become aware, they'll find their voice and they'll challenge the duty bearers who hold the power. So it's a question of education, raising awareness among the rights holders, who will then be able to be in dialogue with the duty bearers and bring about change. And when we talked about the advocacy justice approach, it's about that interaction between the rights holders and the duty bearers that change can come about. For a variety of reasons, some people cannot speak up for themselves and so need others to speak up on their behalf. So in our work in Human Rights International, we sometimes hear of human rights issues on the ground in a particular country. And the local people there send us information which we can then bring to the attention of the UN at the international level. So we're trying to make that link between human rights at the local level, maybe where human rights are being violated or not being implemented properly. How do you bring attention to that from the local to the national to the international level, helping people to speak up for themselves? Now, last week, Human Rights International was asked to speak at the Human Rights Council on behalf of a group of NGOs in Myanmar who feared reprisals. You know that over a year ago in Myanmar, there was a takeover by the military, and there are very serious human rights issues in Myanmar. And these people in Myanmar contacted Human Rights International and said, would you be prepared to make a statement on our behalf at the Human Rights Council? So we agreed to do that. And now I'm going to share you the video of Brian Bond actually speaking on behalf of this group in Myanmar. So again, I'll share my screen.
President. We thank the High Commissioner for her update on Myanmar. In 2021, an estimated 441,000 civilians became IDPs and 1,553 civilians were killed. By the beginning of 22, the situation continues to deteriorate. Of grave concern are the states of Chin, Kaya and Sagaing, where villages are victims of military crackdowns leading to mass arrests, torture, rape and arbitrary executions. Homes and livestock are plundered and subject to arson, while crops are burned and sabotaged with fecal matter and harmful chemicals to ensure starvation. Communication lines are also demolished to prevent the outside world from learning about these atrocities. As fatigued, famished and wounded IDPs flee their homes, the military pursue them into forests, sanctuaries and other villages, causing renewed displacement amid reduced access to food and medical supplies. Humanitarian workers who endeavour to assist them are at times beaten to death, while food aid is diverted for military purposes. We implore the Human Rights Council to urge the de facto military authorities to 1. Immediately cease all acts of violence against civilians, and 2. Allow unrestricted and non-discriminatory humanitarian assistance for IDPs. We also urge the international community to minimise the impact of sanctions on humanitarian organisations and enable aid delivery through effective exemptions. Thank you.
So there you saw Brian Bond speaking on behalf of a group of NGOs in Myanmar. They were afraid that if they spoke personally, they could suffer reprisals back in Myanmar. So to finish my presentation, I'll go back to my slideshow. So to finish off, I want to talk about the Human Rights Council, which is meeting at the moment, as I said, in Geneva. So the United Nations Human Rights Council is a UN body whose mission is to promote and protect human rights around the world. So it has a very broad agenda. It's dealing with human rights at the international level, right around the world. And the Human Rights Council was established by the UN General Assembly, which is one of the 6 organs of the UN, in 2006, and it replaced a previous organization which was called the UN Commission on Human Rights. So it's now the UN Human Rights Council. It consists of state representatives and it reports directly to the General Assembly. It's a political body with a comprehensive human rights mandate. It's placed in charge of overlooking, overseeing the implementation of human rights right across the world. The Human Rights Council has 47 members and they're elected for a staggered 3-year term of office on a regional group basis. So 47 members, 47 member states make up the Human Rights Council, and the headquarters of the council is here in Geneva. Our office in Geneva is just a 10-minute walk from the Palais des Nations where the Human Rights Council meets, and we can attend the meetings there when they're in session. Now, what does the Human Rights Council do? It investigates allegations of breaches of human rights in member states. So it looks at countries and asks, where are human rights being violated in this particular country? That's one part of its work. And secondly, it addresses human rights issues. And I give some examples here. It would be looking at the freedom of association and assembly, freedom of belief and religion. What about women's rights? The rights of racial and ethnic minorities, the right to work, the right to seek asylum from persecution. These are just some of the issues that the Human Rights Council would be watching and would be keeping an eye on. Another way of stating that would be to say that the Human Rights Council addresses violations, promotes human rights assistance and education, reviews states' human rights records, works to prevent abuses, responds to emergencies, and serves as an international forum for human rights dialogue. At the recent Human Rights Council meeting on the early days of March, the Ukrainian ambassador asked the Human Rights Council to have an urgent debate on the state of affairs in Ukraine. And after the council voted, the ambassador got her wish, and there was a debate about the conditions and the situation that was arising in Ukraine at the Human Rights Council. That was an example of responding to an emergency by the Human Rights Council in the beginning of this month. The Human Rights Council holds regular sessions 3 times a year, in March, which is currently happening, in June, and in September. And then the other office that you need to know about is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And the High Commissioner has a unique mandate from the international community to promote and protect all human rights. At the moment, the High Commissioner is Michelle Bachelet, former president of Chile, and she, as the High Commissioner, has frequent interactions with the Human Rights Council. And during the past month, she would have made several reports to the Council about matters that she was investigating or was examining. And she appears before the Council very often when the Council is in session. That's the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And she heads that office. She has an independent role, and she's the principal official looking after human rights with a separate mandate from the UN General Assembly. So in my presentation, I've introduced the United Nations organization. I've talked about human rights, and I've shared a little bit on the Human Rights Council and on the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I now mention briefly 2 key United Nations documents. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which you heard about in the video, came into being in 1948 and became part of international law in 1973. And a second convention of the UN is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And Edmund Rice International is very much focused on that. This came into being in 1989, and it was adopted by the UN, and it's been ratified by the biggest number of countries. There are several conventions in the UN system, and this Convention on the Rights of the Child is the one that has been ratified by practically all the countries in the world. And here's one article from the Universal Declaration, Article 25. Just look at it and see what it says. Remember, this language is from 1948, so it's a little bit sexist. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services. So Article 25 is really stating the standards of living that people are entitled to. It mentions there about the well-being of people and families, and mentions food, clothing, housing, medical care, necessary social services. That's just one example of one article from the Universal Declaration. And then the Convention on the Rights of the Child, what does it do? It outlines in great detail the standards that apply to the needs of children and binds states to adhere to these standards. So we here in ERI, we're focused very much on these 2 articles, these 2 systems of law, if you like, Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And the Convention on the Rights of the Child has 4 basic principles in relation to children: non-discrimination, the best interests of the child, the right to life, survival, and development, and respect for the views of the child. So when you look at the convention, you see that these are the 4 principles that underpin the articles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, as was mentioned in the beginning, these presentations are being recorded. So if you wanted to look back at this presentation later, you'd be able to watch the recording. And I'm going to finish by mentioning some resources on this slide that you can investigate further. This is a link to a video on the history of human rights, because human rights, people have been trying to establish human rights going right back to the Magna Carta in the 12th century. So this video tells you about the history of human rights. Then this link brings you to the Human Rights Council. You can get all the information about the Human Rights Council on that link. The Universal Declaration, again, full information about it. And finally, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So these are resources that you could investigate to further your knowledge about human rights and the various conventions I've mentioned in this presentation.